Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're taking a deep dive into the myth of the robber barons, a new look at the American capitalists. This one's by Burton W, Folsom Jr, and Forrest McDonald, came out back in 1991.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting book because it pushes back quite strongly, actually, against that, standard robber baron image we often get of the big American industrialists from the 19th and early 20th centuries.
Right, it doesn't just lump them all together. It makes a key distinction, doesn't it?
Exactly. The core idea is splitting them into two groups. You've got political entrepreneurs who basically use government connections, subsidies, monopolies, that sort of thing, to build their wealth.
Okay, using the system.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And then you have the market entrepreneurs. These are the folks the book focuses on, arguing they created wealth by, genuinely innovating, offering better products, cheaper services, really competing in the open market.
And the book's argument is that historians have often maybe focused too much on the political ones or just painted everyone with the same negative brush.
That's the crux of it. And that government intervention, which we sometimes assume is helpful, often ended up hindering things or creating its own problems. The book explores this mainly through four big industries:
Which are?
steamships, railroads, steel, and oil, and the specific people involved.
Got it. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack that argument, look at the stories the book tells about these entrepreneurs, especially focusing on that market versus political distinction.
Sounds like a plan. Where should we start?
Let's jump right in with steamships. The book uses Cornelius Vanderbilt as a kind of poster child for the market entrepreneur, right? Kicking off this whole debate.
Definitely. See, in the early days, the steamship scene, especially around New York, was dominated by Robert Fulton's monopoly. Government granted.
Which meant not much competition, probably higher fares for people.
That's the implication. Limited choices, fixed prices. Then along comes Vanderbilt. The book paints him as this classic market guy, sees the monopoly, sees an opportunity.
So what did he do? This is around 1817.
Yeah. He just starts running his own steamboats, cheaper fares between New Jersey and New York, basically thumbing his nose at the monopoly.
Directly challenging the state-backed system.
Exactly. And people loved it. Naturally, cheaper travel. This whole thing sparked a legal fight that went all the way up.
The big Supreme Court case, Gibbons v. Ogden, 1824.
That's the one. Hugely important. It struck down that state monopoly, said interstate commerce was a federal thing. It basically blew the waterways open for competition, and Vanderbilt was right in the thick of pushing for that.
So competition wins, thanks in part to him. Did he keep competing after that?
Oh, yeah. He didn't stop. In the 1830s, there was this Hudson River Steamboat Association trying to, keep prices high.
Another attempt at limiting competition.
Right. So Vanderbilt starts the People's Line, slashed fares dramatically. I think the book mentions he even offered free rides for a bit just to break the association's hold. His point was that efficiency and low prices could actually build the market.
Makes sense. Drive down the price, more people use the service.
Precisely. But then the book introduces this counterpoint: government subsidies starting to creep into the transatlantic routes.
Okay, so a different model emerging.
Yeah. You have Samuel Cunard over in England lobbying hard and getting big subsidies from the British government. National prestige, mail contracts, that was the justification.
And the U.S. jumped on that bandwagon.
They did with Edward Collins. His line got even bigger subsidies from the U.S. government. The idea was luxury, speed, American dominance.
But how did they actually perform? According to the Guck, anyway.
Well, the book portrays Collins' ships as, luxurious floating palaces maybe, but really inefficient, burning way more coal than Vanderbilt ships, for example. Taxpayer-funded inefficiency, essentially.
Which raises that question again, doesn't it? Do subsidies sometimes just prop up inefficiency?
It's a central theme, and the contrast becomes really clear. When Vanderbilt builds his own transatlantic ship, the Vanderbilt, no subsidies.
And how to do?
It was huge, state-of-the-art for its time, and here's the kicker: it actually beat one of Collins' subsidized ships in a race to England, won the blue ribbon for the fastest crossing.
Wow. So the unsubsidized guy outperforms the subsidized one.
That's the story Folsom tells. And there's more irony.
Yeah.
Part of the justification for subsidizing Collins was military readiness, right? Using his wooden ships in wartime.
Okay, plausible. Maybe back then.
Except Vanderbilt was already experimenting with iron hulls in the 1840s, arguably much better for any kind of naval use, so the subsidy was potentially backing the less advanced technology.
Misaligned priorities, maybe.
Or just the nature of political decision-making versus market-driven innovation. This pattern continues, the book argues, with the Pacific Mail Steamship Company. Got a fat subsidy for the California route during the gold rush.
And charged accordingly, I bet.
Exorbitant fares, yeah. So what does Vanderbilt do?
Let me guess. He starts his own route.
You got it. No subsidies, ran ships via Nicaragua. Much cheaper fares, like a fraction of what Pacific Mail charged. And he even carried the U.S. mail for free on that route for a while.
For free? While the other guys were subsidized.
Yep, just to compete, to show how efficient his operation was. But even so, the subsidized lines kept getting more government money. It suggests, political pull sometimes mattered more than efficiency.
That really sets the stage for the railroads, doesn't it? This tension between political and market forces.
Absolutely. The whole transcontinental railroad dream, a massive nation-building project. And the government was heavily involved from the 1850s.
The Pacific Railroad Act of '62. That's the big one.
That's the one. It created the Union Pacific, the UP heading west, and the Central Pacific, the CP, heading east, funded with huge land grants and government loans. Crucially, often paid out per mile of track laid.
Ah, per mile. So the incentive is just lay track fast, not necessarily well.
Exactly. Speed over quality, over the best route sometimes. The book gives examples of the UP building winding routes, apparently just to rack up the mileage and get more money.
Seriously, wasting resources for subsidies.
That's the charge. And using cheaper materials, like iron rails when steel was becoming available, or poorly treated ties. Plus, you get the huge scandal, credit mobilier.
Right, where the UP insiders basically paid themselves inflated prices to build the railroad.
Yeah, massive self-dealing and corruption fueled by the subsidy structure. The book argues these subsidies had terrible consequences.
Like what? Beyond the waste.
Well, Russian construction through Native American lands without proper treaties or respect led to increased conflict. The free passes and discounted stock given to politicians fostered corruption.
So unintended, or maybe intended, negative side effects.
Big time. And despite all that government help, the UP still struggled financially. It faced regulations trying to claw back money, like the Thurman Law, the Interstate Commerce Commission later on, and eventually went bankrupt.
And the Central Pacific.
The book points to their monopolistic practices in California, using their government-backed position to control transport. So not exactly a model of free market competition either.
Okay, so that's the picture of the subsidized lines. Is there a contrast?
A very sharp one, according to Folsom. James J. Hill and the Great Northern Railroad.
Okay, what's his story?
Hill built his transcontinental line with no federal land grants, no federal loans, 0 federal subsidies.
Really? How?
He was different. He knew the Northwest region intimately. His focus wasn't just laying track, it was about developing the region his railroads served. Long-term thinking.
So not just racing to get mileage payments.
No. His approach was slow, careful construction, quality materials, finding the absolute best, lowest-grade routes, like discovering Marias Pass, which saved hugely on operating costs later. He promoted settlement, encouraged things like dry farming to create traffic for his railroad. Exports were key.
Building a sustainable business, essentially.
Exactly. And the book stresses this irony. The heavily subsidized UP and Northern Pacific struggled or failed, while Hill's unsubsidized Great Northern thrived.
What advantages did building without subsidies give him?
Freedom. Freedom to choose the best materials. He used higher quality imported rails when American ones weren't good enough. Freedom to choose the best routes without political interference. No obligation to carry mail at a loss. Freedom to build essential spur lines where they made economic sense.
It seems like a much more rational way to build a railroad.
That's the argument. The book tackles the counter-argument, too. The idea that subsidies increase the social rate of return by getting railroads built faster.
Right. That it benefits society overall, even if the companies aren't purely efficient.
But Folsom argues the costs of those subsidies, the social costs, the economic distortions, the political corruption, the resulting debt burdens on the railroads, the loss of revenue from land grants given away, the precedent it set far outweighed any supposed benefit of speed.
And those subsidized roads had high fixed costs because of the debt and maybe shoddy construction.
Precisely,
Yeah.
which made them less competitive long-term. Plus, all the regulations that followed were often a reaction to the problems the subsidies created.
And Hill got caught up in those regulations too, didn't he? Even though he wasn't subsidized.
That's another layer of irony. Things like the Hepburn Act, which regulated rates, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, they were largely aimed at the perceived abuses of the subsidized lines, but they ended up hitting Hill.
How so?
Well, the Hepburn Act stopped him from giving discounted rates for exports, which hurt his whole strategy of building international trade for the Northwest.
Undermining his business model.
And the Sherman Act was used to break up his Northern Securities Company, basically a holding company for efficiency. This was a big deal because it shifted antitrust law. Before, you had to prove actual restraint of trade, like in the E.C. Knight sugar case. Now, the existence of a large corporation, its potential power, could be seen as the problem.
Even if it was efficient and built without subsidies. Wow. Okay, let's shift gears. Steel. Crucial industry for America's growth.
Absolutely. And early on, Britain was dominant. But the book highlights the Scranton family in Pennsylvania.
The town's named after them, right?
It is. They're presented as classic market entrepreneurs. They started a big ironworks when tariffs were low, meaning they faced British competition head-on. No special protection.
Took a big risk.
Huge risk. Built a company, essentially built a town around it. They faced downturns, local pushback, all the usual business struggles, but they succeeded through innovation and perseverance, not government favors.
So another example of market-driven success. The book also talks about how that initial wealth maybe didn't last generations.
Yeah, it touches on the idea that entrepreneurial success isn't always easy to pass down, which kind of sets the stage for the next big figure in steel, Charles Schwab.
Not the Charles Schwab, the investor, the earlier one.
Right, the steel magnate. He rose up incredibly fast through Carnegie Steel. A brilliant operator, problem solver, worked closely with Andrew Carnegie.
Played a role in forming U.S. Steel.
A key role, yeah. Though the book suggests his power within the giant U.S. Steel was maybe less than you'd think, more controlled by the financiers like Morgan.
Okay. But then he gets involved with Bethlehem Steel.
Yes. And this is another interesting contrast. Bethlehem Iron, as it was, had been kind of dependent on government contracts, maybe a bit slow-moving. Schwab takes over, injects this dynamic, market-focused energy,
And transforms it.
turns it into a major player, especially in things like armor plate and heavy ordnance, guns for the Navy.
Which must have put him back in contact with the government, right, as a supplier.
Exactly. And this leads to tension. Disputes over pricing for armor plate, debates about whether American companies could compete with foreign bids, threats from the government just build its own armor factory.
The government competing with private industry.
That was the threat. Schwab argued against it, saying a government plant would be inefficient, cost more. The book also points out that the way Navy contracts were bid out sometimes encouraged companies to, well, collude to keep prices high. Unintended consequences of government procurement, perhaps.
Did the government ever build that plant?
They did eventually invest in one during World War I. Schwab himself had actually sold his Bethlehem stock by then, though he came back to the industry later. His own life had ups and downs too, financial difficulties later on, despite his success. A reminder of the risks.
Okay, so steel is a mix of market drive and government interaction. Let's move to oil. John D. Rockefeller. Probably the most controversial name on the list.
Definitely the name most associated with robber baron, I'd say. But the book offers a, let's say, revisionist take. It starts with his background emphasizes hard work, thrift, religious values.
That's a different tone from the start.
Right. It describes the early Pennsylvania oil boom after Drake's, well as just chaos. Very inefficient, wasteful. Rockefeller comes in not as a driller, but a refiner in Cleveland.
And his edge was?
Efficiency, an obsession with it. Cutting costs, improving processes, finding uses for byproducts, just relentlessly driving down the cost of refining kerosene. That's portrayed as the core of his success.
The market entrepreneur driving efficiency.
That's the argument. Standard Oil grew incredibly fast, buying up competitors. Now, the critics focused on that consolidation, the alleged ruthless tactics. Muckrakers like Henry Damaris Lloyd, Ida Tarbell.
They painted a very negative picture.
Absolutely. But the book counters by emphasizing the result for consumers. The price of kerosene plummeted, made light affordable for ordinary people. And it argues that Rockefeller was generally fair, often paying good prices, offering stock when he bought out competitors.
So challenging that narrative of pure exploitation.
Yes. It also highlights his global vision, taking on Russian oil, which actually had some natural advantages. Rockefeller's strategy was sometimes to sell incredibly cheap, barely make a profit, just to win market share globally.
Again, benefiting consumers worldwide with cheaper oil.
That's the impact stressed in the book. It also talks about his management style, meticulous detail, motivating workers, his philanthropy later in life, his calmness under pressure, even facing huge fines.
Like that massive $29 million fine, which was later overturned.
Right. It presents a much more complex figure. Then, of course, there's the Sherman Antitrust Act and the eventual breakup of Standard Oil in 1911.
How does the book frame that?
It suggests that the trust structure wasn't primarily about monopoly power, but more about finding a legal way to manage a huge, complex business efficiently across many states with different laws. A tool for efficiency, essentially.
Interesting perspective. Okay, one more key figure the book covers, Andrew Mellon.
Yeah.
But he's more about tax policy, right?
Exactly. Mellon provides a lens on the government's role from a different angle: fiscal policy. He was a very successful entrepreneur and banker before becoming Secretary of the Treasury in the 1920s.
And he had some unconventional ideas about taxes for the time.
He really challenged the prevailing wisdom. The common sense idea was you raise tax rates, you get more revenue, you lower them, you get less. Simple.
Seems logical.
But Mellon, based on his business experience, argued the opposite, at least with high income tax rates. He believed very high rates discouraged investment, risk-taking, work. People would rather find loopholes or just not earn the extra dollar.
So high rates could actually shrink the taxable base.
That was his theory. So in the 1920s, he pushed for significant cuts to the high income tax rates left over from World War I.
And what happened?
The book highlights this. Government revenue actually went up after the tax cuts.
Went up, even though the rates went down.
Yeah. The argument is the lower rates unleashed economic activity, more income was generated and reported, so the government collected more total tax, even at lower rates.
That's pretty counterintuitive. Was this controversial?
Hugely. Remember the context: the Progressive era had pushed for income taxes as fairer. Mellon's cuts were attacked by progressives as just giveaways to the rich.
That's the standard criticism you hear.
Right. But the book presents IRS data from the time suggesting that while the rich got the biggest rate cuts, their share of the total income tax paid actually increased. The cuts, particularly on lower and middle incomes, meant the burden shifted more towards the top earners.
So the data, according to the book, doesn't support the idea it was just a handout to the wealthy.
Not in terms of who paid the taxes, no. The book also defends Mellon against charges that he manipulated audits for personal gain, arguing those accusations were politically motivated and unfounded.
It's a very different take on the 20s tax policy than you usually find.
It is, and it contrasts Mellon's policies with the tax hikes of the 1930s, arguing those hurt lower-income groups more, something often overlooked by historians critical of Mellon. It really emphasizes the need to look at the actual data on tax history.
So across all these examples, Vanderbilt, Hill, Schwab, Rockefeller, Mellon, the book, seems to be building this consistent argument.
Yeah, it loops back strongly at the end to this idea that many historians have, well, gotten it wrong. They've perpetuated the robber baron myth, focused on negative portrayals, and advocated for more government intervention, often ignoring the evidence presented in the book.
Criticizing the textbooks, essentially.
Very much so, pointing out how figures like Vanderbilt and Rockefeller are often presented negatively, while the failures of government subsidies or the success of unsubsidized guys like Hill get glossed over.
What about the idea that maybe it wasn't about individuals, but broader organizational changes?
The book pushes back against that too, the organizational view of business history that downplays individual entrepreneurs. Folsom argues that the creative mind and innovative spirit of individuals like Vanderbilt or Hill were absolutely crucial.
And this connects to ideas about social mobility, too.
Right. If you believe entrepreneurs were just exploiters, you might have a dimmer view of upward mobility. The book critiques some early studies on that topic and presents evidence suggesting mobility was actually quite high, especially in fast-growing areas where these entrepreneurs were active. Wealth wasn't static. These market entrepreneurs created opportunities.
So pulling it all together, what are the main takeaways the book wants us to have?
I think it boils down to a few key things. First, that crucial distinction: market entrepreneurs versus political entrepreneurs. Second, the argument that the state, historically, often failed as an economic developer in these key industries, and its interventions frequently had negative consequences.
But it's not arguing for no government role at all.
No, more for a limited state. One that protects property rights, enforces contracts, maybe provides basic infrastructure, but largely stays out of picking winners or subsidizing specific businesses. That kind of environment, the book suggests, is what allows market entrepreneurship to flourish.
And it also mentions philanthropy.
Yeah, that the wealth generated by these market entrepreneurs often funded significant philanthropy libraries, universities, medical research, another contribution sometimes overlooked. And it notes how hard it often was for these figures to pass on their success, that entrepreneurial drive, to the next generation.
So the ultimate message is to move beyond that simple robber baron's label.
Definitely. To get a more nuanced understanding of American economic history, recognizing the difference between wealth creation through the market and wealth acquisition through political means, the book argues that's essential for understanding the past and maybe for making better policy choices in the future.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the myth of the robber barons, it really presents a strong case, doesn't it, for seeing market entrepreneurs as the key drivers of that incredible American economic expansion.
Yeah, and it consistently contrasts their success built on innovation and efficiency with the often problematic results of government intervention, subsidies, and politically connected businesses.
We saw that with Vanderbilt challenging monopolies, Hill building without aid while subsidized lines struggled, the Scrantons competing internationally, Rockefeller driving down prices, even Mellon's controversial but seemingly effective tax cuts.
It paints a picture where competition and market forces, even if sometimes looking messy or ruthless, ultimately delivered more value than centrally planned or politically motivated efforts.
Which definitely leads us with something to think about. Here's a final thought for you, the listener. As you look at our economy today, all the debates about tech giants, regulation, green subsidies, industrial policy, how useful is this distinction the book makes between market entrepreneurs focused on innovation and value and political entrepreneurs maybe more focused on securing government favors or protection?
Are we seeing echoes of Vanderbilt versus Collins or Hill versus the Union Pacific in today's world? It's definitely worth considering. When you read the news or think about the kind of economic future we want to build, it encourages a critical look at who benefits from different policies.
Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on Books and Bytes.